Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar on budgeting for security and proposals. I am Anna Carey, Solutions Manager at disasterready.org. A few housekeeping items before we get started. All attendees are currently on mute to reduce background noises. If you have questions at any point during this presentation, please feel free to submit your questions to all panelists via the chat window. We will address your questions during the Q&A portion of our webinar. Please join us today on Twitter and share any comments or questions with the hashtag DisasterReady or our Twitter handle @DisasterReady. Finally, today's recording, as well as a copy of the slides, will be posted on DisasterReady within 72 hours. Now I will pass off to my colleague, Bob Nutting, Director of Learning at disasterready.org. Bob?
Thank you, Anna, and welcome to all of you. We're really pleased with the wonderful showing that we have here today. A bit about our host today. DisasterReady.org is powered by the Cornerstone On Demand learning software. This is a free, easy-to-use online training resource that provides e-learning courses created to help prepare humanitarian aid workers for the challenges and demands they face in the field. The goal of DisasterReady.org is simple. As you can see on the screen there, it is to increase the preparedness and effectiveness of humanitarian aid workers around the world by providing accessible, affordable, high-quality training and support. Apologies there. Designed by experts in staff development and humanitarian action, DisasterReady.org is the result of a collaborative nonprofit effort between Cornerstone On Demand Foundation and the leading aid agencies that you see on this slide here. I'd love to give a shout out to each of those organizations and thank them for their participation. Our topic today is budgeting for security. This webinar is a part of a blended coaching series which will include additional online collaboration activities to share ideas and best practices and an optional second coaching webinar on May 20th. I will share more information about that at the end of the webinar about how you can participate in these follow-up learning activities. We're fortunate today to have 3 subject matter experts to discuss this topic, and I would like to introduce each one. First of all, let me apologize for an error in our online promotion that you may have seen. In our original announcements last month, we were planning to have 2 other panelists to join us who have since had to pull out due to various conflicts. Fortunately, however, we were able to secure 2 additional panelists with more than 30 years combined experience. Our facilitator today is I messed that up, Pissalidis. And Lackey has 20 years of experience in the security field and is the Interaction Security Director. He is responsible for supporting and strengthening the security community and its ability to protect staff in the field. Lackey heads Interaction's Security Unit, which supports several initiatives, including an outreach program to help NGOs establish a security framework and supporting the UN NGO Saving Lives Together initiative. 2 additional panelists that will be joining him today include Lisa Reilly. Lisa has over 16 years of experience in the development and humanitarian response sector. As the Executive Coordinator of the European Interagency Security Forum, Lisa exercises overall responsibility for the EISF Secretariat, which supports the collaboration and exchange of information and best practice between EISF members and EISF's wider network of humanitarian security risk specialists, as well as liaising with and acting as a resource for UN agencies, academic institutions, and donors, etc., to develop appropriate policies and best practice. Lastly, we're happy to have Ira Russ also, who has 15 years experience in the security field and is the Director of Security at Education Development Center, or EDC. This is a nonprofit headquartered in Waltham, Massachusetts. At EDC, he oversees safety and security for 1,500 employees in the U.S. and in 30 countries where EDC implements education, health, and youth projects. And now I will pass the baton over to Lackey.
Thank you, Bob. Good morning from Washington, D.C., everyone. What we'd like to discuss today is budgeting for security, risk management, and proposals. We'll be covering some 4 key points that we've extracted from a curriculum, a one-day curriculum course that we run here in Interaction. First, we'll be talking briefly about NGO security as it pertains to humanitarian humanitarian development community. Then we will look at how to best calculate the cost of security risk management. We'll see how absolutely central is risk assessments in this endeavor, and then discuss some typical costs associated. Finally, and if we have time to do this, we will discuss an exercise we designed for you, for those of you that may be able to join us in May. Okay, so NGO security risk management. So when we think of conventional security, we think of these things, right? These are typical images that come to mind: police, guns, armed protection, guns, tanks, more guns. It's security as it's regarded as we call it, a deterrence. It says basically, don't hurt me because I can hurt you back. It's not ideal for us. For one, it alienates us from our beneficiaries. Being heavily field focused, we need to work very closely with the beneficiaries we serve. This type of security won't allow us to do that kind of work, but we need to do it. Second, it's operationally impossible. Think about how many staff we have living and working in remote locations around the field. We'll have to have close protection and detail following them very closely. It's very difficult to do it, if not impossible. So it's not ideal for us. The other is also, aside from delivering aid, we look to restore dignity, and this conventional type of security doesn't really help us do it. In fact, to us, managing security is not an end in itself. Its own depth is to deliver aid and or development, and all parts of the organization we work for must contribute to that end. Correspondingly, our primary concern in NGO security risk management is to produce those circumstances that allow us to deliver the humanitarian aid. One of the key principles, excuse me, finding a hold. One of the key principles, one of the key tenets of the Security Advisory Group here in Interaction is that security must enable. More specifically, it actually, the tenet actually reads, organizations and their staff at all levels must begin to comprehend safety and security not as a limiting or constraining factor, but as an enabler for the delivery of programs. Safety and security should not be regarded as an addendum or attachment. Instead, it should be understood as an essential component of global programming that supports safety and consistent access for and delivery of programmatic action. All right, so what we've learned thus far is NGO security risk management is not entirely like conventional security. Correspondingly, costs associated with it are not going to be the same either. So now we have Lisa Reilly from the EISF to tell us how do we calculate those costs. Lisa, is there a particular percentage that we should be looking at adding to a budget for this particular type of doing security risk management?
Thanks, Aki. I would say no in terms of a particular percentage. It's an easy way out that organizations follow, but it's not necessarily particularly helpful. 3 years ago, EISF commissioned a research project to look at best practice. Sorry, let me change the slide. To look at best practice for costing security risk management amongst humanitarian NGOs. The key finding was, in fact, there was very little best practice available, and we ended up doing a discussion paper looking at how looking at the issues instead, and that led to the cost of risk management paper that the EISF published a couple of years ago. What was found in the research that there are no norms generally for how much risk management costs. research showed that there was little consistency or understanding with most organisations who included anything at all using an arbitrary percentage. And this percentage varied from 3 to 30% in high-risk environments. At the top end, this can be a huge amount for a project to absorb as an overhead. And so we often end up having no cost for security risk management included in the proposal, and then no money in the budget to implement something when we actually start the project. We do need to try and get away from this arbitrary percentage. We know that donors will not allow an arbitrary percentage, so if we want sufficient funds to be able to maintain access to sustainable programming, we must be able to justify the risk management cost. I mean, this makes sense to me, and I assumed an arbitrary percentage would also be something that we wouldn't accept from partners we were funding. However, my colleague was in Pakistan in February, and she interviewed a number of the local NGO partners who said if the INGO that they worked for allowed them to include costs for security and risk management, they said, well, just include a percentage. So it looks as if it's a problem that's occurring at many levels. So one of the things that's included in the EISF paper is this risk management expense portfolio tool. So it doesn't roll off the tongue very easily. And this is a tool to be able to help people justify the cost for risk management. For this to work, the risk management must be included as an integral part of any program management, including at the design, planning, review and budget stages. Standardized approaches to risk management expenditure will lead to improved program efficiency and effectiveness, therefore improving our ability to reach and maintain access to vulnerable populations even when the risks are high. As Laki said, the only reason we do security risk management is to enable programs to happen. But if we don't have the budget, we can't do that. So when we're talking about this, it's not about being risk averse or minimizing risk management costs, but rather providing information and knowledge to improve our understanding of risk management costs and to maximize the impact of limited financial resources. Hopefully most of you recognize the project cycle and are used to using this. Security risk management needs to be included in that project cycle. Unfortunately, for most people, as you can see on this, the security measures are added only during the implementation phase, and that doesn't work. An example from one of our members tells of the frustration in her organisation when a particular project team came to her with a plan for a program in Pakistan. They'd done the whole proposal and detailed it all out, but their policy required a security plan for that proposal. So they came to the security manager who looked at the policy and said, well, unfortunately, we can't do this. We can't put a security plan in for the design of the project. And so that was cancelled. So security was seen as the action that stopped the project rather than one that enabled it to happen. However, if you manage to integrate security risk management throughout the project cycle, you have a much better chance of being able to get the cost incorporated. When risk is part of the planning and design, you're in a much better position to include their associated mitigation costs in your proposals. Pretty much all proposals will have a section that includes project risks and details how you will mitigate against those risks. And we must make sure that security risks are incorporated in that section, because these also have a direct impact on your ability to implement your program. Once you have the risk and mitigation measures included in the description within the proposal, you can include the cost in the project cost. One example of this is using the log frame, which most proposals these days still include, and you actually have this column which talks about risks and assumptions. And you need to make sure that the security risks are also included in the log frame. So to summarize, if we're going to include costs in the proposal, we need to make sure that they're included in the right place within that risk and mitigating measures. So you have to identify what are the risks. You need to work out what your risk management measures are going to be, and you need to calculate the costs for implementing those measures. And once you have all of those steps, you can incorporate them into the direct costs in the proposal. One thing you need to remember is that if acceptance is your risk strategy, risk management strategy, that there are also costs associated with that, and you need to make sure you include those in your proposal as well. However, before you can actually start thinking about the costs, you need to make sure you have a risk assessment. And I'm going to hand over to Ira, who will talk more about that.
Thanks, Lisa. So we talked about the background. I'll talk a little bit about the risk assessment. Conducting a proper risk assessment is critical to ensuring that the security framework you budget for is done correctly. There are three elements which factor into a risk assessment: identifying threats, how likely are the threats to impact your activities or likelihood, and what is the impact each will have on your staff, assets, operations, and reputation. Each risk assessment should be unique to the location, organization, and project. At the same time, it is critical that the risk assessment is consistent throughout the organization, so the various risks you encounter in various locations are mitigated against and budgeted for in a consistent manner. So in this section, we will focus on how to conduct a risk assessment, assuming you already have a good understanding of your organization's risk profile, attitude towards risk, and the context in which you're operating in each country. As Lisa said, there aren't best practices, but the recommendation is to conduct a risk assessment as part of the bid, no bid discussion before entering in a new country or an area of the country. So even if you're operating in a country but starting an activity in a new place, you should conduct a risk assessment and properly budget for the risks in that location. And at least on an annual basis, and then adjust your budget as needed based on the conditions changing during the course of time. If the situation is developing either negatively or positively based on triggers you establish in your plans or feedback you have from staff or people on the ground, you also need to conduct a new risk assessment, and based on that, identify new budget requirements. And if you need new additional funds, approach the funder for those measures. Now, a risk assessment should not be conducted in a vacuum. It should be structured and disciplined to ensure that we remove any biases which we as individuals bring to the table. So ideally, gather a group of people either from the country or are familiar with the country and with the project and activities, but also the organizational risk profile to conduct a proper assessment. Bringing them together in a group helps ensure consistency and accuracy. There are a number of steps to doing a risk assessment. The first one is to gather the information, which will help us identify and clarify the different threats in the country. This information can be gathered from staff, partners, public sources like newspapers, the internet, and also approach various organizations like OSAC, other NGOs already operating there, and groups like Interaction or EISF. You can also approach any partners or in-country NGO forums which exist, and you can also access various security company sources which can give you additional information. You want to evaluate this information to identify who is impacted by the threat how and why they're impacted. And consider how likely each threat is to impact your activities. And based on this information, you identify the type and scale and mitigation measures you want to put in place. And then you budget for those correctly. Let's get into each one of those with more detail. So threat is defined as someone or something that can cause harm or loss. In the natural setting, it might be referred to as a hazard, like earthquakes are hazards. But typically we call them all threats. You have a limited control over threats. You can only take precautionary measures that attempt to prevent them from causing harm or loss to reduce their impact. It's common when you identify threats to focus on sensational things like terrorism, but it's key not to overlook basic things like car accidents, fires, or other measures. When you review threats, there's two different ways of looking at them. There's direct threats, which is when an organization, its staff, assets are specifically targeted. These include crimes against staff, if they're identified as working for an influential or wealthy NGO, harassment by government officials because of sentiment against the aid you're providing, or kidnapping of a staff member to make a political statement. More often, we as NGOs face indirect threats. That's when an organization, its staff, or assets are not directly targeted by but are still impacted. Indirect threats include natural disasters, random street crime, electrical short circuit that causes a fire, anything that happens in your facilities. Knowing whether a threat is direct or indirect can help you decide how best to mitigate the threat. As you can see here, we have a laundry list of various threats you might face. Normally, when we conduct a threat assessment, we divide things into man-made, so civil unrest, crime, terrorism, corruption, natural threats, earthquakes, volcanoes, flooding, and then safety issues, pandemics, car accidents, airplane crashes, fires. The degree to which you list each threat depends on the operational environment you're in. So in a country with a lot of terrorism, you might focus on breaking terrorism into very specific issues such as body-borne suicide bombing, car-borne suicide bombings, complex attacks. But in a place that doesn't have a lot of terrorism, you may simply want to list terrorism as a general thing. Same with crime or natural disasters. For example, if you work in the Philippines, has a lot of natural disasters, you want to break them down further into volcanoes, earthquakes, typhoons, because how you mitigate against an earthquake is very different than how you mitigate against an Okay. The next step is likelihood, also sometimes referred to as a vulnerability. The terms tend to overlap to a large degree, but in general, we think about likelihood of how likely is an event to occur in an environment in which we're operating, and how likely it is to impact you if things are left unchanged. Vulnerability looks at how vulnerable you are to a very specific threat, and you have much more latitude in mitigating that threat, that vulnerability, because it looks at how specifically you're impacted. So, for example, if you work in an area that has a lot of flooding, you cannot control the likelihood of flooding. You can control your vulnerability to the flooding by where you place your office. Now, when determining the likelihood or vulnerability to a threat, when you gather the information, you should look at the following factors of each risk level. So the frequency, how often does the threat occur? Distribution, is the threat widespread or limited? Location, is the threat confined to a certain area, a location? The time of day when incidents occur? Who is targeted? So if it's not NGOs, if it's big companies, how does it affect you as an NGO? If it's NGOs, or the NGOs which do specific activities, so who are the victims and the targets of those incidents? And then any patterns or trends which you can recognize, which help you then design mitigation measures. So if the threats tend to happen early in the morning, Do you move your activities to the nighttime? What does that mean in terms of how things affect you? You then classify the likelihood on a scale of 1 to 5. 5 being imminent or certain, which means given no change, the event will occur. The high likelihood that the occurrence is much greater than that of non-occurrence. So for us, we tend to classify that as something within 70 or 90% likely to occur. 3 is moderate, possible, but would be unlucky for us to be impacted by it. So I put that in the 50th to 70th percentile. Again, you don't have to be precise in how you view these, but the reason you bring a group together is to get a different sense of how it is. And it's understood that different people will read likelihood differently because of how the information we bring, how we identify that information, and how we review it. So it's understood that likelihood could vary based on the assessment, but if you bring a group together, you can come up with a good average and determine how likely it is to impact you. The next step is to identify impact. Impact is easier to be more exact. The key when you review impact on your organization is to set your definitions accurately, sort of how likely are you to agree on what is a significant financial loss and what is not insignificant. Once you identify those barriers within your organization, it's easier to be exact in your definition. The key is to focus on not just safety and security, so how are things going to impact your personnel, but also how are things going to impact your assets, financial loss, how are they going to impact your operations, short-term and long-term, and how are they going to affect the organization's reputation, both within the community and with the donor. And again, here, you want to put them on a scale of 1 to 5. 5 is critical, canceled operations, death or severe injuries to staff, massive asset loss, and down all the way to negligible, which is minor operational disruption, no injuries, no damages. And again, if you establish clear criteria before you start the process, it's easier to classify impact on this regard and think about all 4 elements. So personnel, assets, operational, and reputational. Once you've reviewed all 3 elements, the threat, the impact, and the likelihood, you gather them together and into a matrix. So what you're left is a residual risk. So how is the potential for suffering or harm or loss due to each of the threats going to impact you based on the individual threat, the impact of it affecting you, the impact it has on you, and the likelihood of it affecting you. What we normally do is we map these various risks on a matrix in which we chart the likelihood on a scale of 1 to 5, from certain, imminent to unlikely on one side, and negligible to critical on another side. This is a good way to visualize the likelihood and impact on an organization, and also to kind of get the risk level that actually affects it. So anything in red is deemed as very high risk, and these are things you must take actions to mitigate against. Anything in orange is deemed as high risk and things you should mitigate against. Anything in green, which is low risk, are things that you don't necessarily need to take actions to mitigate against. So once you take the different threats, identify the likelihood and the impact, you can map them on this matrix, and it helps you identify which mitigation measures you should implement and to what degree. To give you a more specific example, let's look at an example of 3 types of threats in northeast Kenya. The first one, we can look at it and say a car accident in a rural area without paved roads, in an area that doesn't have a lot of trained drivers and without hospitals. This is something that we could say is a highly likely event to occur, and the impact would be severe. We say severe because there aren't a lot of hospitals, so you need to budget for, in order to mitigate against this, you need to budget accordingly for the proper things like not having hospitals, so you need good medical kits, you need to train your staff in providing first aid. You need to have the first aid kits, and you need to have transport. You want to provide your drivers with additional training on how to avoid accidents. So anything that ends up in red, you need to take significant action and budget for significant action to mitigate against and move it into the lower levels of risk. And another example is body-borne suicide bombing. We could say that these are possible, they may happen, they may not. And the impact would be critical because you're operating in a fairly rural area. There's not a lot of international NGOs, so there is a good chance you might be a direct target if someone wanted to cause harm to you or an international organization. So we could say it's possible and the impact is critical because you could be directly targeted. On the other hand, petty crime in that part of the country is not very common, so it's unlikely to happen, and the impact would be minor. Then you compare that with an operational environment in Nairobi, which you could say because of heavy traffic, train drivers, and good hospitals, the impact of a car accident would be moderate, and it's just possible to happen. So the likelihood drops and the impact drops, something that is not as significant to budget for and mitigate against. On the other hand, you can look at petty crime. In that kind of environment, you're pretty much certain it's going to happen, and even though the impact remains minor, the risk level is higher, so you do want to take action to mitigate against, whether it's just training staff on how to respond or how you go to the banks and withdraw money. Okay. At this point, I'll turn things over to Laki.
I think I'm going to have to repeat that. Okay, so thank you, Ira. So I was saying, so let's say now we have identified the threats in our respective operating environments. What we have to do next is figure out what we're going to do about reducing those likelihoods that they're going to occur, right? What we really have to do next is actually do a risk mitigating measure, which is what we're talking about here. So these are security protocols, incident mappings, trainings, monitoring of the environment. All of these are things that you're going to do to reduce the likelihood of that thing happening to you. These risk mitigating measures are all going to have costs associated with them, right? So you're going to note those down. The other thing we're going to have to do is contingency plans. Contingency plans are plans that we have to put into effect that when the risk that we've been trying to avoid actually happens to us. So despite our best efforts, one of these threats that was identified comes to be. What we're going to do, we're going to run to our contingency plan. Contingency plans also have costs associated with them. So that is also going to be make it into our costs to be covered. So that's your package of costs. We're going to turn to Lisa and ask what are some of the typical costs that we see, and how do all these translate into concrete types of costs. Lisa?
Great, thanks, Laki. I mentioned previously about the risk management expense portfolio tool, which is included in the cost paper, as well as providing a worksheet and memory jogger for people putting together the proposals. It can also work as a translator. It enables donors, security managers, program people, proposal and grant writers to actually understand each other as well. The tool identifies 12 clusters, which are shown here, and each cluster is further divided into individual line items, and I'll show you a snapshot of the spreadsheet in a minute. Some costs may be obvious, such as the salary for the in-country security advisor, guards, and wall reinforcement. However, others may be less obvious but equally applicable. For example, if your policy on security management says that all expatriate staff must go on a personal security course, then the costs for every expat included in the proposal should include those training costs. It is a direct cost. If satellite phones are required to have a backup communication system, that should also be included as a direct cost. We talked about acceptance. If additional visits are required to communities along access routes in order to develop an acceptance strategy, those costs should also be included. And to take an example, as Ira mentioned, if you identify driver training as a key measure to reduce the impact of a car accident that can have a severe effect on your programs, that should be considered as a direct program cost because it's needed to keep your program going. So all of these items can generally be justified as direct costs, assuming you have done the risk assessment in the first place, you've developed your mitigating measures as part of the program design. The tool within the research paper does provide a baseline. However, organisations using the tool can make additions to the list of line items based on their operational parameters, and the web version of the tool allows users to modify the expense portfolio to meet the specific organisation, and it can be seen to evolve into a more automated system. To give you a snapshot of the tool, as you'll see it on the website, and you can see, can't get the arrow to work. No, at the top of the slide, you can see the link to the research paper in the tool on our website, and I believe Bob will be putting that in to the notes as part of the webinar as well. If you use the tool, senior managers can have a clear understanding of how the risk items have been estimated and where they are allocated within the budget. This in turn can be clearly presented to donors by allowing budget line items to be linked to a specific risk management measure. A dialogue with donors will be proved to be more effective when a logical and evidence-based format can be put on the table. Attaching the risk management expense profile tool and the outcomes of the risk assessment of proposals will provide an effective means of demonstrating a logical, justifiable and evidence-based budget. It will also enable organisations to see how different programs in different contexts and levels of risk actually affect costs, which at the moment generally that information isn't available. Most line items represent tangible costs, but the tool also provides the space to consider marginal and intangible costs. For example, a percentage of a salaried staff time dedicated to an acceptance approach to security management. So, for example, if the country director spends a proportion of their time undertaking activities to improve the acceptance approach, the tool allows for including that sort of percentage. And just to sort of reinforce, if you do have a proactive acceptance approach to security, it does have a cost. So just to summarize, the tool we've been talking about helps us to estimate and record security risk management costs accurately, but only if there is an accurate risk assessment on which it's based and that risk assessment is embedded within the program design. And on that note, I'll finish, and I think I hand over to Bob to lead us into questions.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you to all of our panelists for an excellent webinar introduction to the complicated topic of budgeting for security. At this time, we'd like to open up to some questions that we've received in the chat room, as well as information that you continue to share with us in the chat room. So, Lackey, I'm going to turn it back over to you, and I believe we have some questions ready for our panelists.
Bob, we have quite a few. The first one, I will ask both the panelists, but Lisa, I think you and I have been speaking about this quite a bit, so maybe it's maybe you can speak to it first. It says often the main issue is that in budgeting, the donor looks for the best cost to beneficiary ratio, and as such, the program versus support costs. Every time I have seen an accurate budget, it comes back saying the support costs are too high, whether that is internally or from the donor. Often this means that the operationally support element in staff and equipment is severely squeezed, making accurate or proper safety management difficult, or at least compromised. Now, some donors are better than others, but what do we do to influence donors more to allow better budgeting, in particular as we go forward and budgets are increasingly scrutinized? So, yeah, let me just put it there. Lisa?
Thank you, Lucky, and thank you for the question. Absolutely agree that the issue is often around that proportion of support costs. When I started working in the humanitarian sector many years ago, it was very common for vehicle costs to be considered as an indirect support cost. And I remember having a discussion with the team where I was saying, you know, how do you get your goods for distribution to the field? And they said, well, in the trucks. So I said, so why are the trucks listed as a support cost and not as a direct cost as part of the program? Because if you don't have that vehicle, if you don't have that truck, you're not actually going to be able to get your goods to where they need to be. Now, I think these days that's generally been recognised and we see that happening. We need to think about security in the same way. If you are undertaking something, a risk mitigation measure, such as travelling in convoy or satellite phones to have a duplicate communication system, that isn't an indirect cost. You're saying the only way we can actually be able to undertake these programs is with these measures in place. So we need to start costing them out specifically and identifying them as direct costs rather than support costs, because they're there. And that can only happen if those costs are really integrated right from the beginning in the project cycle. In terms of influencing donors, it's something that EISF is doing with a number of the European donors. I know Interaction is doing the same in the US. We are trying to raise the issue with them, and I think it's something that more donors are recognizing. But it goes back to us being able to justify the cost. To me, if somebody came along and said, oh, I just need 5% because it's a high-risk environment, I'd want to say, what are we getting for that 5%? So the more information we have, the better position we're in to actually influence the donors and justify the costs that we want. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Lisa. What I would also like to add is the question actually points it out. There is a lot of internal misunderstanding as well. Often budgets get cut before they even go to donors. I know of 2 that have gone hoarse and have even put it out in writing that they will cover justified costs of security. And one of the things that we do here in Interaction, besides try to talk to donors, in the course itself is we bring donors to critique what you, the participants, would likely put into your budgets and discuss whether that would get through or not. 95% of the time, a justifiable cost in this simulated exercise at least goes through. The donor would say, yeah, this is typically something that we would cover. So I wouldn't throw it all entirely on the donor. And you're right, there are better ones and there are ones that are less aware of this. But the big part of it is us within our own organizations. Okay, we have a list of large questions. Ira or Lisa, is there anything else you want to add, or should I go ahead with the next question? Okay, I guess that is a no. This is directed at Lisa. Lisa, in your experience, how do you justify contingency costs?
It's a good question, and that is one that's more difficult to justify with contingency costs. I think the most common contingency cost we're aware of is insurance, and I think we have to look at the other items along those lines as to how do we justify that we have insurance, because that's justified the contingency plan. I know a number of organisations who have been unfortunate enough to suffer from serious incidents in the past have actually calculated what it has cost to deal with a serious incident. For example, an abduction, and I'm not talking about ransom costs, but merely the cost of running the crisis management team, the movement of staff to and from the field, etc. And when you start putting together those costs, it becomes easier to justify the contingency costs. But I think, as Chris mentioned in the cost paper, justifying a negative is very difficult, because it's very difficult to say we haven't had any abductions because we put these measures in place. You can't actually say that. The causal effect is quite difficult. So it's not easy, but I think costing out consequences of not having the contingency plans in place is a way that you can start. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Lisa. Next question pertains to, it's a follow-up question actually. Next question asks, still it'd be good to know if Interaction has a wider library of recommended downloadable resources that support budgeting for security. The best one is the EISF's paper on budgeting for security is what I would say. That is the only one that comes to mind. The other book that I sent along was the GPR8 as well. That's a set of terms, and there is a certain amount of basics that is covered in there. Aside from that, Ira, is there anything else that you, or Lisa, that you would provide as a recommended support document?
What I would say is it's important to develop your own estimates. There isn't anything set, and you can, once you identify which issues you need to mitigate against the organization, develop standards. We use a spreadsheet, which I'm happy to share with people. It's pretty basic. But we look at various factors in that as we budget, and it varies. What we look at is security guard costs at homes and offices. We look at communication methods, and then any kind of training we need to do. And then for the physical security measures, we break it down into more individual elements and then assign a cost to each one of those. So for example, you would look at how many, the cost of installing external lights, upgrading walls to specific heights, changing locks and keys. If we install CCTV, what's the cost of that? If we don't have guards, what's the cost of an alarm system and monitoring? We look at if we need a safe room or if we don't need a safe room, and the cost of access control, ID badges, in terms of upgrades. In terms of communications, we will look at if we need satellite phones, if we need radios for cars or people's houses, or if we need travel phones that are specific to the organization. And then we always budget for safety, fire extinguishers, fire alarms, medical kits, different ones for offices, residences, and vehicles, and then trainings. So any kind of training, whether it's for security focal points, the incident management team, which goes into crisis planning and contingency, you should allocate money to train your incident management team on your crisis plan and how you want to respond. And then, of course, driver training and all staff training.
Okay, thank you, Ira. Since I have you there, don't mute yourself. I'm going to point the next question at you. The next question is, should we distinguish the safety and security? In other words, do you put safety in one category and security in another, or do you budget them all together?
all together. But then, everything has to be broken down by line item. So if you present the budget to your proposal development or the funder, you break it down as much as possible into individual items. But our jobs tend to cover both safety and security, so we focus on that at the same time.
Yeah, I would concur. I would say it's a matter of the line item, and it's also a matter of really justifying it by a risk assessment in the background. The next question is how do we influence program staff to...
Sorry, Lackey, could I just
sorry,
add
Lisa,
to
go
that?
ahead, please.
What you also have to be aware of, depending which donor country you're going to, in a lot of languages there is no separation between the words safety and security. So you also need to be aware of how language is used. And we often make assumptions on things based on English, but it may be very different in other contexts, depending which donor we're aiming our proposals at. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa, for that. That is very central, absolutely. Since I have you on the line, so why don't we just point the next question at you. How do we influence program staff to be more active in budgeting for security and taking it more seriously?
A good question, and I think if we can find an answer to that one that works, we will be 3/4 of the way to solving the problem. I think it has to come from all levels. There is a need to make sure that any staff who actually have a security responsibility are have an active role in the development of the proposal and the development of the budget. So it's done at the time. I think if you have, particularly perhaps in organizations where the proposal writing and the budgeting is done separate to the field office, the people who are putting the numbers in, who are doing the budget, may not be aware of the issues that are happening on the ground. And I think that also goes for a lot of security managers or security focal points. They may not be used to actually budgeting for what they do. So I think it's something that is really an issue that needs to be tackled at many different levels. There's no one person that is going to change this, but it has to go from the security staff, the program staff, program manager, and the people who are doing the budget, the finance team and the proposal writers. And I think engaging people who are perhaps sitting in the office, not going to the field, giving them an opportunity to understand why it's so important for people to have these costs can also make a big difference. So you engage people in the discussion and you get people to understand that it's not just talking about guards, it's not just people being risk averse and not wanting to do the programs, but really explaining and understanding the process can make a big help.
Yeah.
Thank you.
To pick up on a couple of things that you said, Lisa, what I would insist on in the organization is to actually make sure that there are security responsibilities written into people's job descriptions. So it's not just something that somebody does, it's your responsibility. And part of the responsibilities is to watch out for these costs. So project proposal writers, one of the things that they have to do is check in with the security apparatus or security focal point or whatever to make sure that there is a risk assessment done and that there is a mitigating measures written and budgeting in there as well. So line items in job descriptions, one of the things that I would say. The other thing is policy. Make it a policy of the organization and incorporate into security policy documents that you will be budgeting. You will be budgeting against a concrete risk assessment. Okay, anything else, Lisa or Ira?
Lackey, we have time for about one more question.
We have one more question. Okay. Which there are a couple of them that have been answered already. So
And for those questions we can't get to, we won't leave them unanswered.
Okay, so let me try this, and we'll put it both to Ira and Lisa. Considering that most donors cap their grant levels and that any costs put into security reduce what can be delivered to beneficiaries, should advocacy to donors be in the form of an additional to the grant request? Is there space for that? Lisa, Ira? Whoever unmutes first goes first.
Okay. I would say there's definitely room for advocacy to donors, and I think this is where, again, the more information we have on the costs, the better position we are to be able to advocate to those donors. If we just say, oh, we need another 5% because we're working in a high-risk environment, I think the donors would come back to us and say, no, I'm sorry, that's not acceptable. If you can say to them, okay, we're working in a high-risk environment, because of that, we can no longer drive between our project sites. We need to be able to fly between the sites. This is how we've recognized it. This is in order for us to be able to do X, Y, and Z. Therefore, we need more money. And I know we normally do this sort of program for X per beneficiary, but it's now costing Y because of this and this reason. And I think the more information we have, the more detail, the more that we can link security risk management with the program, that if it is seen as an enabler, as Laki mentioned at the beginning, the better chance we have of actually convincing donors that this is what we need to do. And definitely, yes, there needs to be advocacy. We don't want to reduce the amount that goes to the beneficiaries. If there are extra costs, then we need to be able to justify and advocate for that. And to get donors to understand that the context in the world is changing. And for people to not put in good security risk management practices, it is dangerous and not really morally supportable. And we need to take that into consideration. Thanks, Laki.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Ira. Bob, I think that was the last question that you said.
Yes, thank you very much, Laki, and thank you to all of our panelists for an excellent webinar. I'm very impressed with the amount of information that is out there, and thank you to all of our participants for an unbelievable response in terms of your questions in the chat. As my colleague Anna mentioned, we will be providing you an opportunity to discuss each of the questions that were submitted in the chat. As we stated at the beginning of this webinar session today, this webinar is actually a part of a blended coaching series, which includes not only today's session, but additional online collaboration activities to share ideas and best practices, as well as an optional second coaching webinar that is scheduled for Thursday, May 20th. Within the next 3 business days, you will see a posting of the recording of today's webinar along with the PDF of the slides that you've seen today. You'll also receive an email with instructions from Disaster Ready that will help you understand a little bit more about this blended coaching series and the next steps, and including instructions of how to join our online community on Disaster Ready. And then you'll see all of the questions that were submitted in the chat along with responses from our subject matter experts. And then there will be some assignments that you will be given. And those that have the time and availability and the desire to continue, we'll ask you to work on those assignments in the online community. It'll be some questions that we will pose to you and ask you to respond to. And then you'll be invited to the optional coaching webinar on May 20th. You can see also as we close today's session, you'll see 2 additional webinars that are coming up in the month of May. And we encourage you to go back to disasterready.org at your earliest convenience to register for these webinars. We've had a great response today, and we continue to strive to produce excellent webinars that are both timely and effective for you as aid workers in the field and at the headquarter offices. So I encourage you to register on disasterready.org. And lastly, again, we want to thank you for your support. Thank you for your interest in today's topic. And if you'd like to continue the learning, please respond to that email when it comes out to you later, early next week, with instructions to continue your learning on this important topic of budgeting for security. Thank you and have a wonderful day.